Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to give people about 2 minutes to join, so we'll start the webinar at about 1 minute after the hour, but we'll give people just a couple more minutes to go ahead and join. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give people 1 more minute to join. It's top of the hour right now, so we'll give people the 2:01, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, everybody. So I've got 2:01. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, NIST 800-171 in the real world, compliance versus risk. So my name's Kevin Hancock. I'm Director of Sales Engineering here at Exostar. I'll be the host of today's sessions, but I'm very excited because I've got Bob Metzger and Chris Newborn joining me today. Before we get started, just want to cover some housekeeping details. So this webinar is scheduled to last from 45 minutes to an hour. We will conduct a Q&A session at the end. The questions for the Q&A were submitted prior to the webinars, and all those who submitted them, we thank you for those. If for some reason there is an outage during today's session, just go ahead and wait a minute, refresh the page, and that should bring you back in. Haven't had this happen yet, but just in case. For your convenience, there is a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms. This is a discussion about government standards, compliance, etc. So we do throw around quite a few acronyms. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on demand via the Exostar resource library. That's at www.exostar.com/resources. Post-event, you can get it there. You can also use the same YouTube link you received in your email to see a replay if you'd like to. If you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts, or you want a copy of the slide deck that we're going to be using today, go ahead and reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. If you go to our website, www.exostar.com, there is a live chat feature, and the people on that will also be happy to help you out as well. So this is the agenda we'll cover today. And as I mentioned, there is a Q&A session that'll follow. We'd also appreciate it if at the end you did fill out our exit poll. We use that to determine the topics that you'd like to hear about and to plan our next set of webinars. So please fill that out at the end. So as I mentioned, I'm joined by Bob Metzger and Chris Newborn today. I'll let them introduce themselves as they take over their sections. And with that, I will turn it over to Bob for the first part.
Thank you, Kevin. I certainly appreciate the opportunity again to speak to the Exostar audience. And I'm especially grateful to have a chance to join Chris Newborn, who's made such a contribution to the teaching and training of the defense acquisition workforce. I am a lawyer in private practice. I represent companies from small to extremely large in a wide variety of matters, including some that concern national security and quite a few that involve cyber and supply chain compliance and security issues. In addition, I am a consultant to the MITRE Corporation, although I speak here only for myself. I was a co-author of the 2018 report, Deliver and Compromise, that's contributed something to DoD's approach to securing the defense industrial base. I've done 2 other projects for MITRE for sponsors in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I'm doing a project now for civilian agencies that concerns ransomware, and another project that's about to start for DHS that concerns management of supply chain risk information. So I hope that in addition to being a lawyer, which many of you will think is a negative credential, that I might have actually accomplished something or learned something or contributed something that maybe makes me worth listening to nonetheless. Let's go to the next slide. So, we live in a very difficult time. So I'm going to do a quick review of some of the worst over the last 12 or 14 months. And I want you to be thinking as I do this of whether these attacks and their results were the kinds of things that your system would be able to resist, whether it's a manufacturing system or an information system, if all you had was NIST 800-171 and a high confidence of your satisfaction of the future CMMC objectives. We're going to learn some interesting things even going through this quickly. SolarWinds is first. We're going to see that most of the most painful events, had either Russia or Russian actors taking the initiative, and several had China actors. There were also some that involved Iran, and a few, although not on this table, that involved North Korea. These are nation-state actors, and they can be extraordinarily skillful. However, their resources are finite, and we should never assume that they could do anything or everything to everybody at any time. So we have to balance what we've learned of the bad things they can do with the realistic likelihood that they will reach too far. We also have to consider what the consequences to them would be in geopolitical terms if they were to move from an emphasis on reconnaissance and data theft into cyber offensive operations that could do physical damage to your manufacturing systems or to critical infrastructure. We have every reason to think that they could, and we need to protect against that risk. We also have to be cognizant that the United States and its allies have some extremely powerful offensive cyber tools as well. And it continues to be the consensus, I think, globally, that the United States is the best and has the most resources for offensive cyber if it comes to that. So I'm going to cover a few of these things quickly. SolarWinds was an astonishing event. This was an attack on the build cycle for the SolarWinds Orion software, which eventually enabled Russian intelligence not only to distribute malware very widely, but then to target precisely the organizations that it would then reconnoiter and select for exfiltration of information. SolarWinds was something even probably the best experts didn't think was quite possible, and it demonstrated the very most sophisticated capabilities of a persistent, agile, and smart adversary here, Russia, and it also is the principal driver for the executive order 14028 that the president issued in May of this year. We won't spend too much time on that, though. So I'm going to go through the rest of them quickly. It's like the parade of horribles. Vulnerability was found in the Microsoft Exchange server software that could allow takeover by timely opportunistic hackers of the premises systems that employed certain versions of that software. Well, there were other countries or of origin. China is believed to be the principal attacker, and I believe that Hafnium is the name of the group within China to which this is attributed. The next couple of attacks all are linked to Russian organizations that may have been acting at least with state tolerance. These were ransomware attacks that had high impact upon civilian lives. Colonial Pipeline, of course, led to gas shortages. It wasn't that the ransomware attackers went after the gas distribution system. They went after the billing system, and because JBS wouldn't know who had who had received or purchased what, it couldn't operate the system because it couldn't manage the information for billing purposes. Kaseya is another very sophisticated attack looking at a trusted intermediary. Kaseya does managed security service, has a very long list of clients worldwide, and this was an attack that did have consequential effects upon the operations of a variety of businesses in the US and elsewhere. Everybody knows about Log4j. This is yet another example of deficiencies in open source software. Many entities, criminal and nation state, have poked around or exploited that vulnerability. Most of the attribution rests with China and Iran. More recently, we've had to deal with the crisis, now conflict in the Ukraine. And beginning about a month ago, a form of malware called Whispergate was circulating in some financial institutions and elsewhere. Whispergate is a Russian product, it's believed, designed to look like malware. Sorry, designed to look like ransomware, but actually far different. It is a form of wiper malware. Once it's installed on your system, its intent is not to get money, but to destroy all of the information on your system. And I'm told there is a newer version that was detected today. And then to bring us back to information confidentiality, the FBI director just a couple of weeks ago spoke that Chinese hacking program in stealing data was greater than every other country combined. So what do we see here from the threat actor perspective? We see that there are nation state activities that can be very consequential and very sophisticated. And there are private actor, criminal actor threats that also can be consequential and at the very least are accommodated or tolerated by their nation state hosts. We need to think about that as we consider our enterprises and what is needed to protect them against the range of threat vectors, which I'll discuss in a minute. Next slide. I'm not going to cover all my slides. It's impossible in the time I've got, but they are worth looking at. So we're going to go through nation state threats in a little more detail quite quickly. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's worried analysts for some years, and this was featured in the Deliver Uncompromised report, was the notion of asymmetric attacks, where adversaries, conceptually such as Russia, would choose to attack our industrial capability or to erode citizen confidence in government rather than to confront us in areas where we had superior kinetic force. And we have seen what are, at the very least, some sophisticated probes or limited incidents. All of the ones that I've listed are just examples of where there are many others. But none of these, arise to the level that some of us have predicted of active nation-state attempts to disable or destroy critical infrastructure, where that would have a consequence upon, the health and safety of persons in the nation affected. We worry about that capability, and we must protect against it and do our best to be able to respond. But so far, the worst scenarios have yet to occur, and that's true even in the Ukraine. I listened today to a program of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, of which I'm a member, and they had an analyst from Finland, one from Singapore, one who was in Georgia, and they talked about a new study, and they also gave their impressions of the present cyber campaign in Ukraine, which is surprisingly light. Although there have been well-publicized examples of DDoS, denial of service attacks, and wiper malware, these have had relatively little impact, at least as of this morning, or been more a nuisance than injurious. And for the main, they have been able, to recover from those attacks. Well, why is that? I mean, we know that Russia has powerful tools. Well, in this particular area, unfortunately, Russia has extraordinary dominance in conventional military force. And so it's able to accomplish its ends through selective targeting of kinetic weapons, and it need not resort to its cyber arsenal. And there are some reasons that it might not do so. One is that many of these tricks, if you will, once used, can be difficult to use again. And sometimes adversaries can emulate what they learned from the trick that was used to attack them first. Moreover, as shown by NotPetya back in 2017, Russia may not be confident that if it made a cyber attack upon infrastructure throughout the Ukraine, that it would stay within the Ukraine. And if there were collateral consequences outside the Ukraine, that, of course, would tempt the U.S., our partners or allies, into acts of cyber retribution, and our capabilities are formidable. So I think they're kind of holding this hand, if you will, behind their back. It doesn't mean they won't use asymmetric attacks or blended operations covering a number of forms of attack, but so far they have restrained from doing so. Next slide, please. I want to emphasize this slide particularly because it shows us that there are multiple attack vectors, and if I don't get much further than this slide, I will have accomplished something. So in our MITRE report, we looked at essentially 4 vectors for attacks through the supply chain or against the supply chain. One is cyber IT. Those are network delivered attacks against your premises systems or storage. We also looked at cyber physical systems and operational technology. We looked at supply chain and broke out the distinct sub-vectors of software, hardware, firmware, and service providers, and the workforce. And the workforce is actually the 4th category. It doesn't seem to come out with the right emphasis. So here's the short version. All of these things have happened. All of them have been attempted. All of them have been successful to a degree. And our adversaries have probably perfected their weapons in each of these areas, such that if the occasion arose, they could do a great deal of damage through all of these vectors. And to those who are affected by such attacks or rely on systems that could be exposed. I want to focus just for a moment on cyber IT. Here I'm going to combine nation-state threats with those from ransomware operators. And I should mention that ransomware operators include the people that you know are criminal, but they also can include nation states who are conveniently using ransomware to appear criminal and to avoid attribution to the state actor. North Korea is believed to be an example of that, where it uses ransomware for state purposes to essentially get money to support their weapons of mass destruction and missile programs. So, exfiltration is what most of the CMMC is about exfiltration. The DFAR 7012 clause is about exfiltration. CMMC is about exfiltration. The whole point of all of those is to protect the confidentiality of a certain class of information called controlled unclassified information. They're not worried about the availability of systems or the integrity of information that remains on those systems. However, attackers have shown us that all of those things are at risk. And when you get into the area of ransomware, of course, extortion is one of the objectives or methods used by a ransomware attacker. And denial of access to a system, that's almost always present. Your system is locked unless you pay the amount extorted. They are now, of course, engaged in double extortion, which is where they will both deny you access to the system and steal your information. Triple extortion is where they threaten, essentially blackmail you by threatening it to release it to competitors or to release it publicly and to cause you injury to personnel or to your enterprise value. But, at the worst end of ransomware attacks is destruction. And that's illustrated by these 2 Russian attacks in the Ukraine that mimic ransomware in their appearance, but actually have no purpose other than to destroy completely all of the files in the system on which they're lodged. Now, I could spend, an hour easily kind of walking through examples here, but I want to make this point. When you're focusing upon SP 800-171 and the 7012 DFARS clause, you are essentially addressing the red box under cyber IT exfiltration, and you are not addressing all of these other things. And so I think a point that Chris and I agree on is that enterprises, you can't defend yourself against the most sophisticated adversaries. You're not going to stop an APT attack from Russia. But you can make the workload harder. You can improve your chances to recover more swiftly, and you certainly should be aware of the range of threats to your enterprise. Next slide, please. So this kind of makes a point that I should resonate. Most of what we have seen so far in the many successful attacks, largely by China, against information security is the theft of proprietary information and valuable technical data, so that the Chinese can blunt our technological advantages, mimic them, or find ways to exploit them contrary to our interest. And it's been said that trillions of dollars worth of U.S. IP has been stolen by China, and they're still at it. But there should be no misunderstanding. They likely have the power. Russia even more likely has the power, if the circumstances come to it, where they could use similar attack vectors and methods, not just to steal information, but to corrupt your industrial control systems, your programmable logic controllers, and the like. We did it some years ago in Operation Olympic Games. It is alleged affecting uranium centrifuges. And so, if we move towards a crisis where there's more international injury and international participation in cyber conflict domains, unfortunately, there is a real chance that attacks could be done on a targeted basis to degrade, deny, or otherwise damage our factories, our critical infrastructure, and our national logistics resources. And this is why at the very first page of my program, I put the cyber security advisory that was put out jointly by NSA, the FBI, and CISA late in January, because it's warning against exactly these threats. And I think Chris agrees with me that if you read nothing else after this program, that's something you should read. Next slide, and I'm going to abbreviate shortly. I want to go through ransomware very, very quickly. Next slide. So I mentioned there are 3 tiers. It's a massive global enterprise. Now, as annoying and painful as it is, and horrible as it is if you experience, it's never yet been used, for statecraft purposes, except primarily to steal money. And you should know that the dominant criminal actors who are responsible for creating ransomware toolkits and for effecting ransomware reside in Russia. And you should also know that there are nation-state actors, including Iran and North Korea, who are capable of using ransomware for their own purposes, which would go beyond just getting a ransom. They could care less, for some of them, North Korea cares, but where they're essentially using that vector. Next slide. I want to just make this the central point. Virtually none of 800.171, I'll make it more clearly. 800.171 was written to protect premises systems against a perceived array of threat to the confidentiality of information. At the time that it was issued, at the time that the 7012 DFARS clause came out, we weren't worried about ransomware. We barely knew it existed. But now ransomware is a plague that can attack anyone, everywhere, at any time. And even if, it often results in pain, disruption, and payment on 1 or 2 industries, the truth is that there's not a single company represented on this call that it is not at risk of 1 or several forms of ransomware. And so as you think about the sufficiency of your enterprise defenses, you want to go beyond compliance with 171, and you want to be thinking very carefully first about how you can improve your barriers to ransomware, but most important, how you can be certain that if you are attacked, that you can recover competently and with assurance in your data. I will stop there. There are other slides that I think you listeners would find interesting, but I leave it to you to peruse them if you are so disposed.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. Let me switch the discussion over here to our other guest speaker today, Chris. So, Chris, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bob, you made my job easy because letting the audience know in regards to the not the threat, but the capability of the threat and their interest in regards to how they're going to meet and be successful. Because as we all take a look at it, cybersecurity is a very enterprising from a business standpoint. You have at least an 80 to 90% chance of being successful, and the return on investment is tremendous, but yet the attribute of somebody catching you is very little. And that's very disturbing, especially between Bob and I. We try and figure out how we're going to circumvent the rules and regulations and provide good, you want to say efficient and effective capabilities against these particular entities, and we fail because we can't defend all the time. So my specialty is really looking at it from a programmatic standpoint. And when you go down to the next level, I look at it in regards to trade-offs as well as from a contractual standpoint. So my job and responsibility is to really teach and consult with the acquisition workforce to ensure that the information that we identify that is sensitive right now, controlled unclassified information, is safeguarded against adversary, as well as we rely on the primes, the subs, the manufacturers, the vendors to bring the innovation to us, to the workforce, as well as to the warfighter, so they can meet their mission and be successful. So my job is to bridge that gap from an acquisition standpoint and say, these are the requirements. This is how we're going to evaluate. And we want you to be successful because we need your technology, but we also need it to be safeguarded. Next slide, please. So everything that Bob was saying was spot on, and I always approach it as why we need DFARS to protect sensitive information. And this was really based on a RAND report that was just sent out in January this year. And it really focused on Russia and Chinese in regards to their strategic plan and what they have to increase their GMP. I mean, this is a business decision. This is what they're looking at in regards to making money, acquiring technology, and becoming dominant in the global market. So the first thing for Russia, and I could say a few other things based upon the few events that taken on the last couple of days, was that their whole thing is looking at it from a manufacturing standpoint as well as the exportability. So even if they were to develop and build, because the sanctions that are on them, it's very hard to get their products out. So again, they look at it from a cyber perspective. And then for China, everybody knows, and I highlighted the most important things. Number one, investing in our acquisition for foreign technology and joint ventures. The only reason why they're doing that is to acquire and to get access to the proprietary information from a manufacturing and processing standpoint. Before, they have been very successful in acquiring our technology and reverse engineering that. But when it comes to the manufacturing process, the United States is #1 in the world. But if we're #1 in the world, guess what they're going to be coming after? They're going to be coming after those processes and procedures. And remember, who has those processes and procedures? It's not the primes, it's not the major subs, it's the manufacturer vendors. It's that 15, 20 man shop that's located in South Dakota that does stamping processes for screws and bolts. And they've been doing it for the last 20 to 30 years. And that's using a German manufacturer machine that dates back to the 50s and 60s. But it's the process and procedures that's on the drawings and the documents to tell how it's made and the quality assurance and the reliability. That's the information that now these nation states are after. And we have to make sure that we do everything we possibly can to safeguard that information that allows us to produce the products and the services that are required to support the federal government. Next slide, please. So after, myself, and I also have a colleague, Dr. Paul Shaw, we have done so many numerous workshops as well as interviewed and talked to probably over 400 vendors and manufacturers. This is what we observe, and I think is key for you to understand and to start looking at and prioritizing based upon what Bob said of ransomware and all the other issues that are pending in regards to trying to safeguard the information. The first one, when you take a look at implementing, and I say the 109 security requirements, it's really 110 that extra one is the system security plan, which has to be safeguarded. So when you take a look at the security requirements, there's really not enough incentivized money out there for meeting the small business to actually acquire. In fact, the sad thing about it is the government really thought that a lot of these vendors, manufacturers were already doing this, and that it was going to be a no cost to incorporate the rest of the security requirements. Well, that was definitely a misconception there, and it's very hard to try and figure out how you're going to add these extra costs into your existing business plan without elevating that price point that makes you competitive, as well as makes you very, you want to say, interested to other primes and subs to pick you to do the manufacturing. So that's the first thing. The next major thing is on my third bullet, to the second to the last, is why you think of basic security knowledge, from a large and medium firm. For the small business, they're doing everything. So the security aspects of saying, oh, I'm going to know how to implement and execute those security requirements, or I'm going to know how to buy that tool to integrate into my system so I can understand how to monitor. That is really not realistic. And it gets down to the point where a lot of the medium and small businesses have to make a determine, am I going to do this in-house? If I can't do it in-house, do I have to outsource? How much money am I going to use to outsource that? And then what are the trades? What is the service level agreements are going to be between me being in control and somebody else being in control of my destiny? So this is the complication, from a contractual standpoint and from a business standpoint of saying, how do I defend against these nation states which have unlimited resources, as well as, time is on their hand. They are going to be attacking constantly on a 24/7, as well as using artificial intelligence to implement and execute these tools against your process and procedures, as well as your systems and your networks. And then the last one is the flow down of the security requirements. How low do you go? And one of our problems that we have in the government, as well as the prime, is the distribution of control information, control unclassified information. We want to push it down to the lowest level and then put the requirement to say you got to safeguard everything, whereas it may only require a piece of the information in order to perform what they need to do from a contractual standpoint. And I give you an example, a base on the command where they want to hire a landscaper just to do the cutting the grass, planting the landscape. And what does the government do? They send the entire technical data package of the base to this landscaper. Well, number one, it's like, and they say, oh, you got to implement DFAR clause 252.204-7012. And I say, what the heck is that? And then they say, oh, you got to do the guidelines too. This is way too much, and this is an expectation where they're gonna fail. And if they decide to even comply, now you just jack the contract cost even higher than that. So what you're gonna end up doing is you're gonna end up losing that particular landscaper that has been doing the job fantastic for the last probably 15, 20 years, and now they're no longer capable of doing it because the government put them in a bad position of trying to safeguard a complete technical data package that is not required. Let's move on to the next slide. So we have to think of better ways to do it. And this is where Bob and I are getting into the point where when you look beyond the NIST, when you look beyond the government statutory and regulatory requirements, what are the things that I need to do? Well, the first thing that I always talk about is you really need to identify and associate the information types that you have on your network and systems. And these are driven by your business decisions. Whereas the first one, if you deal with the government, there is going to be government sensitive information that you're going to have to be safeguarding. Number two, because most of you all are manufacturer vendor, you are going to have client and customer confidential information that you are going to have to protect yourself. So this is one thing that you're going to have to think about to say, How can I be a trustworthy vendor and manufacturer and instill the confidence to my customers that I can safeguard their own personal information? And then the next one, you have to think about your own proprietary information. And then the last one, you're going to have your business public access information that you're going to use to advertise. So these are the things that you have to think about above and beyond what we consider government sensitive information you have to protect. You have to protect your own information. And I keep remembering, going back to what Bob said, look at all those bad actors and look at all those access points that are now a opportunity for an adversary to come in and steal and acquire your information. It's not necessarily due to government information. It's also through your clients, your customers, your stakeholders in regards to you and that trust that you have. And then the second part is when you take a look at your network yourself, how are you going to protect that information? And again, one of the things that my colleague and I have realized is that probably only 90 to 95% of the vendors and manufacturer has what we call a flat network. And what we mean by that is that's one network that has all the information contained on it. So just imagine you have your government sensitive information, your client customer information, your business confidential information, and your business public information all on the same network. It's all flat. And then all the adversary has to do is fake like they want to be a client or customer. They get onto your network and then they have control of all the information. And then the good thing about it is now they're going to be vectoring from you to your business partners in regards to your subs as well as the primes, and they'll have an advantage of vectoring off to that, as well as if you deal with any government folks. So this is where we're trying to get you to understand that as you move from this isolated, you want to say, enterprise to now a global enterprise network, you have to consider and you have to think about all these things in regards to how you do business, how you partner, and what your partnership relationships are. Next slide, please. So when you start putting this together, and to me, I love this slide. I received this from, again, my partner that I teach with, and he does an excellent research in regards to taking a look at from a network standpoint. Again, when you take a look at the data security pattern and the architect that are associated with this, you know, in the perfect thing, what you're going to do is you're going to have some information that's going to reside on your network, and then you're going to probably use some type of cloud service provider. So you'll have information in a cloud, and then you'll probably use some major support provider or major security support provider to help out in regards to meeting your security capabilities. And each one of those are a entity and an opportunity for an adversary to slip in and to cause havoc. You have to always think that way, as well as understanding the information types and who has access to that information. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, you have to be cognizant of that. And you have to, what we do is the monitoring. You have to continue to monitor to say what is authorized, what is unauthorized, and for the things that are unauthorized, what are the impacts in regards to good, bad, or indifference. You have to continually monitor that, and you have to understand the interactions of the data mixing or the data separation. You know, for Bob and I, what we always preach is you have to have the data separation because each information type has its own impact as well as consequences of loss. So therefore, when you mix the two together, you are saying, oh, I'm going to protect it at the highest level. But that success of now saying that you have to protect the entire network at the highest level is the same thing as in my home. You know, I have jewels that are invaluable that I'm going to lock away. And now, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep the jewels on the kitchen counter, and now I have to safeguard the entire house like it's Fort Knox, which you can't not only afford, you can't achieve. And Bob is saying something like that. And he's on mute. He doesn't understand.
You know, a lot of people prefer me on mute, but network segregation, I mean, that's part of what Chris is saying. You know, if you have the traditional sort of flat architecture network where the only security is to kind of get inside the perimeter of the network, and face it, a lot of legacy firms have just got that. You know, if you have a user ID and a password and that's good enough, well, then you are in the network and you can roam around as much as you want. Look at most things, maybe everything, take something home if you like. In today's situation, that is, you know, asking for catastrophe. It's not just a bad idea, it's a terrible idea. You know, at the very least, you want to have, you know, improved identity and access controls. You want to look to network segregation. You want to distinguish between types of data and its criticality to you or to your customers or to the ultimate, you know, public client. And you want to provide different levels of protection, you know, that are particularized to the types of information. And as Chris also mentioned, really have to be aware of what's happening to your network more or less on a real-time basis. You know, I think both of us have mentioned that advisory that came out, you know, in January, and it just gives huge emphasis to the importance of robust log collection and retention, to looking for behavioral evidence of network and host-based artifacts. It emphasizes monitoring and having the tools so that if an attack is underway, you know it before the fatal damage is done. You have at least some opportunity to mitigate. Back to you. Sorry for the interruption. Just trying to do a little Me Too support.
Oh no, this is perfect, and this gets into what we're talking about, going beyond protection, going into resiliency. In order to be able to recover and restore, you have to have the capability to identify. And in order to identify, you have to have the capability of what's on your network. And to me, in order to understand what you have on your network, you have to be able to identify the different information types. Because again, what we're looking at is the information types. We understand the endpoint devices, but when you just look at the information alone, and this is what the adversary is after, this is a key thing of ensuring that as you separate the information, then you're able to see who has access, who doesn't have access, and look at it not only from they're supposed to get access to that information, but also if they accidentally get information from the access, what is the damage, what is the recovery, and then how do you restore? Next slide, please. So one of the things that I really want to bring out is, and again, it gets back into what Bob was talking about, is the 5 attack types, you know, which he mentioned. He said ransomware, but also there's malware, web application, hacking, insider privilege, and misuse. So when you take a look at over the last 3 or 4 years and really going into 2022 and looking at what is going to happen in 2023, these are the areas that you really need to focus on, and taking a look at the security capabilities, security controls, and what I look at it as, if I don't do this, what is the impact to my business? Understanding that so you can now prioritize and integrate that in your business process and in your plan. So moving on to the next slide, please. This to me is a key and a justification of whenever we talk about the government and say, hey, you're supposed to capture all these particular security controls in your system security plan. And then for the ones that you don't have, you're supposed to capture it in your plan of action, or we call plan of action a milestone. That plan of action, a milestone, really is your technology roadmap. And that is what you're going to be doing to continuously monitoring and continuously improving your, I call it security posture, but your business process and procedures. Because if you're able to secure and safeguard that, then you're going to be successful in becoming a trusted partner. not only for your clients and customers, but also if you were to provide product and services to other government entities, you're going to become that in regards to confidence. And this is a way of taking a look at the top 5 attacks, as well as to say, if I was to invest, and if I was to utilize 171 in regards to my baseline, what is the success? And I'm not talking about just, oh, well, I'm just going to do 30 security controls out of the 171. We're talking about investment of all of them, because the adversary is just not going to use 1 or 2 or 3 techniques. They're going to use all the techniques, and you have to do it. You have to incorporate and implement those security controls from a aggregation standpoint, because you're going to have to address that. And it shows to say, if you just incorporate that, and I'm going to go to the next slide, in an earlier sense, then you're going to be able to achieve at least anywhere from above 80 to all the way to a 95% efficient and effectiveness in regards to what you're trying to achieve. And again, I'm looking at it not only from a protection standpoint, I'm looking at it from a resiliency standpoint. And from a cybersecurity professional, I always look at cost, schedule, performance, as well as risk, but also I look at it from a people, technology, and a process and procedure standpoint. And I say, what can I do to increase and include more capability to the point where I meet, and this is what we call my as safe as reasonably practical. So this takes a look at establishing a baseline, or I call it a watermark. So right now, the watermark that we have for 171 is confidentiality at a moderate level. We still have availability and integrity, and that includes additional security controls from, I call it the NIST SP53. But when you take a look at the basic ones that Dr. Ron Ross used in regards to the 109, he really was looking at it from a confidentiality at a moderate level. So when you start taking a look at that, and you start looking at the return on investment, if you time it perfectly in regards to looking at the C, and I don't have enough time to really go down into the details of the chart, but if you reach that particular point, then you're able, what I call the flexibility of taking that flat network and starting to segregate and separate those information types. And when you start doing that, now you start looking at the key critical component, and I'm saying the most important thing of taking a look at access control. You'd be amazed at how much return on investment that you get just from access control. And this gets back into the contra of what I look at it as of security versus availability. I always look at that thing, and a lot of people say security versus availability. I look at security and availability, because the more availability I have to now look at it in regards to what are the impacts in regards to from a security standpoint. And I get into a polarity. I'm sure Bob understands. I get into a polarity, and I go down to a deep dive, and I do the quad chart. But this is something that each company needs to take a look at to say, you know, what can I do beyond just the confidentiality? What can I do to increase my integrity and availability? And what do I have to do in regards to, you know, if I do have that security and I have to expand availability, what are the impacts there from a business standpoint, as well as the advantage of it? And still, can I still perform those capability in-house, or do I have to outsource it? So this is going to be the dilemma. And Bob, go ahead. And you're on mute.
You would think I would learn, but that's the law school side of my background. So, you know, there's some interesting things here. Everybody has heard about zero trust. You know, it's a complicated thing. It's essentially the inverse of, you know, the historical paradigm that all you needed was a username and a password to get in. The zero trust essentially denies you availability, you know, unless you come from an approved device and go to a place in a network where you have privileges and you are asking from the right place and asking for the right use for the certain types of information, unless you have all of those things put together at a particular time when the system decides that you can be trusted and it assumes that you cannot, well, then you don't get any availability. Is that bad? Well, if you can make it run efficiently and it doesn't stop your business, from performing in its track, it's great. Because the biggest problem, and it's so true of those examples I put in from the horror list from 2022, is when adversaries can literally take over your server, your premises. This could happen with Log4j, this could happen with Hafnium. If they get in there, they can basically run around, do reconnaissance, take in anything they want, deny, corrupt it, disrupt it. Can't let that happen. And one way you can stop that is by moving storage systems where availability is very tightly managed, and where you are, where you recognize that, we increasingly use remote access and we use personal devices to do work. There are ways in which you can improve the security so that not anyone with a remote device from anywhere, even with what appears to be a bona fide password, under a zero trust solution, that may not work. If you're coming through an IP domain with what appears to be a proper username and password, but the IP domain is someplace that's not registered, not recognized, or considered a hostile country of origin, well, that'll stop you. And we're going to have to move in those directions. And also, as to integrity, one of the simplest ways to protect the integrity of your information is to encrypt it at rest, and in transit. And I know that many of us are working towards that where it's possible. It can be pretty difficult to do. But if you have successfully encrypted information and a ransomware attacker gets it, they are not able to make any use for it. If you have successfully encrypted information and you've done a really good job on backup and you've tested it and you've demonstrated that it works, well, they can shut your system down, but you'll be able to restore, the system information with integrity from that encrypted backup. These are some of the ways in which you can approach solutions that are pragmatic and likely to be successful. Final point.
I was going to say, and Bob, just to add on to what you're saying. So as a business person, if you're a 1 or 2, this gets into your service level agreements or your business level agreements. Each contract that you have, each one that you have partners, you really have to look at it from a business standpoint and then apply the technical aspects of it to say, okay, if I terminate my business, then what access to that partner still has? This is a key thing. If you're still terminating and you're still allowing that person in through the back door, then guess what? This is, again, an avenue that the adversary is going to do, especially in the supply chain from a globalization standpoint. And this is where we say zero trust. You have to tie in, I know the technical folks that always say, oh, zero trust and everything. It's really zero trust in regards to the sales department. And then when they sign that contract, and of course, when they sign the contract, the other person said, I want access to everything. And this is where you need to develop that service level agreement and that business agreement and tie it in with the IT to ensure that the trust is there and that there's very limited in regards to access, and the trust builds. So as the trust builds more, they're allowed more access. If there's very little trust, then they should be in the waiting room. For instance, like we always do in oh God, not Zoom, but the other webinar where you sit in the webinar
WebEx.
And you're waiting for somebody to get in, and you're on the wrong, you're in the wrong meeting. So this is the same thing in regards to you need to think about these things as you integrate the technology into your business processes. You have to think that way, and because as you expand, you're going to be having a lot of good business partners, but also you're going to have a lot of bad business partners, and you need to understand and control that. And again, I'm going to tell you, we as the government identify and we let who we do business with, and we have to start protecting that in regards to the lower level of what Bob is saying, and zero trust, as well as other techniques, process, and procedures to ensure that we limit and we look at it from a CIA perspective. And now I will hand it over. That's my last slide.
Yep. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, Bob. Just a couple points to kind of bring it back a little bit to the 871, since I know based on the questions, a lot of people are still around that. But please understand what Bob and Chris talked about is, kind of as Bob mentioned up front, 800-171 is very much about the security of information. It's about it is, if you will, the defense of that information. It does really nothing around those other vectors of attack. And that's really what we wanted to bring home in this, that NIST 800-171 is a starting point, but there's so much more that needs to be done to, if you will, protect your systems, your information, all those other things that you do. But just to kind of, again, just to let everybody know what, on the NIST 800-171 side, if you will, if you've got a contract that has the DFARS clauses that shows here, right? You're required to comply with NIST 800-171. And as part of that, there is a self-assessment you need to do to generate your SPURS score to be input into the SPURS site, so the DoD can see how you're doing, right? This is kind of where you need to be today. We at Exostar can help you get there in a few different ways. We have 2 applications. These are SaaS applications that allow you to get started down the 800-171 path. We have Policy Pro, which lets you build those policies, right? It gives you examples and the first steps in building those different policies you need to write to enable those 110 controls. We have Certification Assistant, which allows you to do that self-assessment, that allows you to generate that SSP that Chris talked about, the POAMs, which are the remediation that you need to do, and that SPURS score. So you have all of those packaged together so you can comply with those DFARS clauses that are part of your contract. Then if you do find some areas where you need some help, Exostar helps around onboarding the people you're working with, providing them the credentials they need, because in working with NIST, you do need 2-factor authentication, and you need to be able to prove who you are and all those kinds of things. And then we also offer some secure collaboration tools to exchange that information. So that's what we can do at Exostar to help you. There are a number of no-cost resources out there as well. We've got these listed here in the presentation. As I mentioned before, if you'd like to get a copy of the presentation, and I would encourage anyone, any and everyone to do that. Bob didn't get a chance to cover all his slides, and there's a wealth of information amongst those. There's also pointers in here to those free information sources for everybody. Before I start on the Q&A, just wanted to remind everybody to please take a minute to answer the exit poll. But did want to be able to at least get to some of these questions in the few minutes we have left. So we get this question a lot. I'm going to ask Bob first, and then I'm going to bring Chris in as well. So with all the talk around CMMC and NIST 800-171 and the DFARS clauses, et cetera, Bob, where are we today in kind of the CMMC 2.0 launch, if you will?
Well, the CMMC 1.0 potentially would have applied to 200,000 or more companies, and to anyone who had federal contract information all the way up to highly impactful information just short of classified. And under 1.0, everybody who had any of that information was going to have to be assessed by a third party and get a certification. And to get a certification, you'd have to get a perfect score, not anything less, when the time came for your assessment. This was, in my judgment, well-intended, but reaching too far, with too few resources, producing too much burden on a schedule that was not realistic. So 2.0 applies a more rational approach. It limits the number of companies who may be assessed to just those who have one or another form of controlled unclassified information. It's going to have a rollout that might take 5 to 7 years. It still relies upon third-party assessment, still from these private organizations called C3PAOs. But there is no requirement today that any company get a C3PAO assessment. There are companies, sorry, DoD is encouraging people to do it as early adopters, but they're not requiring it. And that's because rulemaking has to proceed for the regulations to change to accommodate the new program. And depending on who you talk to, the rulemaking won't be done for 12 to 24 months. I want to stress this, that even though the CMMC program is in development and not yet being implemented as a contract requirement, companies that have CUI or have that 7012 clause, they are obliged to provide adequate security right now using SP 800-171. And they are obliged to have a system security plan and do a self-assessment and report the results of their self-assessment as a score to SIPRs. And they're also obliged to report on the SIPRs when they plan to close any gaps. These are important obligations which exist today, even though the newer rules to implement CMMC 2.0 are sometime in the future.
Great, thanks. Chris, I want to give you one question, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap it up because we are at the top of the hour again. So we get this get this question a lot because it does apply to those tools and those other things that, if you will, can help you get to the 800-171 compliance. So do we really need to be in Microsoft GCC High to be compliant with NIST? And what's the risk of staying in commercial?
No, that's an excellent question. This gets back into really taking a look at your network and looking at what information you want to receive. So, as a DAU professor, I always say it depends. And this way I can get out of and it really depends on how the company is receiving their controlled and classified information. If they're going to receive it as a whole network, then I would say, yes, you have to be GCC high, but I would put that as a caveat. That's a substantial cost, especially if it's a small company. If it's a small company, then the best thing to do, or the response would be to try and limit or obfuscate the controlled or unclassified information that's being disseminated. This way, you don't have to now reflect your business system or network to 171. So and the 7012. What you want to try and do is isolate it. Isolate the information, which is much, I would say, less expensive. I mean, it may be to the point where you can't do it, and you just have to suck it up. And this is where I talk about trying to make a decision where you're going to be doing it in-house or you're going to be outsourcing it. If it's to the point where you have to have CUI as a network, then a capability or a option would be to outsource it to a cloud service provider. And it may be to the point where it's a little bit cheaper, efficient, and more effective than trying to do it in-house and now having your entire system reflective of protecting CUI, even though all you're going to be doing is acquiring maybe 10% of CUI within your network. That's not a justification for the expense. So again, you look at it from a business standpoint, and you look at it from I call it a contractual standpoint, to see how much a percentage are you actually utilizing CUI. And then again, looking at it from a most efficient and effective standpoint, it may be to the point where you can outsource it and it's cheaper to do it that way, more efficient and effective than it is to acquire in-house. You may just not have the competency in your business to actually do it. Over. I mean, sorry for the long answer, but it really depends.
No, as you said, it really does depend. So want to thank everybody for joining us. We did go a couple minutes over, and I appreciate all those who stuck with us. Again, we do have some additional information. And as I mentioned before, if you request the slide deck, we'll be happy to send it over to you. Again, this will help you get started. It'll give you those other sources of information you may need to make the best educated decision for you and your company. Just please do that exit poll for us. I appreciate it greatly. And I want to thank everybody for your time today, especially thank Chris and Bob for their time today. And we look forward to speaking to you at our next webinar. Thanks so much.